Continuing here in chapter 5 of How to Read a Bible for All It's Worth, we're going to be in slide number 20. Again, kind of concluding on the idea of looking at the character's words and understanding it. And they give the example here of Judah's character as it changes in the story of Joseph in Genesis 38 through 50, okay? The narrator shows special interest in Judah. Why? Because Judah is the one who argues for selling rather than killing Joseph, yet his own moral life is highly questionable, okay? There's a story told in Genesis 38, that Judah will assume the rights of the firstborn through whom Israel's eventual king will come, and because his offspring will continue the motif of the choice of the younger son, okay? But so when you look at Judah in chapter 38, you're like, good grief, really? The line of the tribe of Judah coming through this guy? But the purpose, again, going on in Genesis 39 through 50, on top of the character change that's going on in Joseph's life, is there's a character change going on in Judah as well, which is why he becomes part of the lineage of Jesus, because of this character change, okay? There's a radical change of character. Okay? He's willing to sacrifice his own life, okay, for other brothers, okay? In other words, something is going on in the guy's life. So if you go to slide number 21, they talk about the importance of dialogue, okay? Which obviously, the dialogue is important in any kind of story. So they give examples here how this happens in the brief scenes at the beginning of the story of Joseph in Genesis 37, 5 through 11. Okay, Joseph's narration of his dreams reflects just straightforward arrogance. Look what I did. Look at how I'm going to be exalted, right? Everyone's going to bow down to me. In other words, you might want to keep your mouth shut, kid, because you're probably going to get popped by your brothers, which is kind of exactly what happened. His brothers and faith in father's response both sets the plot itself in motion. Will you actually rule over us? In other words, that kind of gets us thinking, okay, this is going to get a little dicey here. It's expressly brought to conclusion by way of the narrative at the end of Genesis 50, verse 18. Okay? But in contrast to his brother's hatred, his father kept the matter in mind. Okay, so in other words, that's a clue. Hey, we need to keep the matter in mind. Okay, in other words, something's going on here with these dreams. And something's going on that, in other words, could this actually come to pass? And then you start seeing all that takes place in Joseph's life where he's finally in this prison. You're thinking, there ain't no way this is ever going to happen, right? And yet, that's sovereignly what the Lord does, okay? So second of all, we're talking about dialogue. Contrastive dialogue, and this is on slide number 22. Contrastive dialogue often functions as a way of characterization as well, okay? Note the length of Joseph's reply, Genesis 39, 8 through 9, to the very brief invitation of Potiphar's wife. You'll see a different kind of contrastive dialogue with the final speeches of Judah and Joseph, by which the first plot resolution is achieved. Number 3, very often the narrator will emphasize the crucial parts of the narrative by having one of the characters repeat or summarize the narrative in a speech. So this happens particularly in the speeches of the brothers. So in other words, so don't yield to the temptation to speed read through these repetitions. They often tell you very important things about the point of view of the narrative, okay? And you also have to realize, too, that these books of the Bible were primarily delivered orally to people listening to them, okay? So they're not necessarily reading this, they're hearing it. Okay, so one of the ways, if you're a great storyteller, you might repeat some things for emphasis to kind of steer people towards where you're trying to go, okay? So in other words, sometimes we're like, gosh, I heard it already. I already know that. Think it through. When they originally heard it, in other words, when they originally received it, they heard it. So that's one of the ways in a non-literary culture, okay, that you communicate emphases and an emphasis to them by repeating different things, okay? So again, let's go to the next slide. This is slide number 23, talking about plot, okay? Plots can be either simple, okay, the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38, or complex, the entire Joseph narrative, Genesis 30, and then 39 through 50, okay? Several subplots vie for attention during the unfolding of the major plot. How the conflict between Joseph and his brothers brought Israel to Egypt, Okay, that's another plot that's going on there. Okay, you'll find that the plot in Hebrew narrative moves at a much faster pace than most modern narration, even that of the short story genre. Okay, so as you look at the major plot and its resolution in any narrative, be alert to the various devices the narrator uses to slow the pace of his story. Okay, this happens by dialogue, the sudden elaboration of detail, or other forms of repetition. In other words, when suddenly all this dialogue kicks in and it slows it down, hint, 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 ding, 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 right? Be sensitive to that. That's a clue. This is really, really important, so pay attention to it, okay? Very often, a slowed pace is a signal pointing to the narrator's focus or point of view. So again, don't yield to the temptation to skim read or to speed read through these, okay? Going on to slide 24, features of structure, okay? In ways that most of us in modern settings can hardly appreciate, Hebrew narrative uses a whole series of structural features to catch the hearer's attention and keep him or her fascinated and fastened on the narrative, okay? The reason for these features is something that often escapes us, okay? These narratives, even when written down, again, this is what I just said, were primarily designed for hearers, not readers, okay? The idea of reading silently did not happen till well after the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century AD, okay? Most of the time people heard it. Or even if you could read, you generally read aloud. You did not read silently. So these Hebrew narratives were written in such a way so that people could hear them. Okay? Imagine, in other words, if you're writing a letter or a story or whatever, are you going to write one way for a group of people that are primarily reading them versus another way so people can hear them? Okay? I'm doing this right now in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic, where I am not only, in other words, when I write my sermons to preach, I'm writing them for exactly that, to preach. In other words, I'm writing them in such a way that it's not sentence by sentence by sentence by sentence, but in a way that's preachable, okay? So in other words, there's all kinds of emphases going on so it can be preached, right? But what I'm also doing right now is I'm creating blogs. I'm literally taking my sermons and writing them down. In other words, writing them in such a way that it could be posted in a journal, in an online journal, or some publication, or even a newspaper, okay? You're gonna write that differently because you're writing primarily for people to read them, okay? Why am I doing these? Well, first of all, I love to write, and it actually helps me develop my message better if I write it that way, even though I'm not gonna preach it that way. But another reason why I'm doing that, and is really important, is there's a number of our people in our church that do not have access to the internet, okay? So they can't hear our sermons, or they don't go on Facebook, they don't go on YouTube. They're not gonna hear our sermons. So for the period of the 6 or 7 weeks or so that we've been disconnected as a fellowship, they're hearing nothing. So what I'm doing is I'm writing them out in a, how do I say, a journal or story kind of form, or something that's interesting, okay? In a way that they can still hear the sermon. Okay, does that make sense? In other words, it's going to be different. The way you write is going to be very different if you're giving a speech or you're going to preach versus if you're going to write for the express purpose of someone reading it in a journal or a newspaper article, okay? That's what we've got to realize as we're reading historical narrative. In the Old Testament, it was written for people to hear, okay? So there's different cues and clues and hints in the narratives we've got to pay attention to, okay? So they say here on slide 24 at the back end, in a time when our senses are bombarded by dozens of images in a brief 30-second television commercial, taking the time to hear a text is a lost art. Okay, this is why when I read my Bible, I listen to the audio version as well, okay? What is it, the U version of the Bible? You can get the app. I read the NIV version, and I listen to it as well. So I'm getting double the information, okay? If you just, what do they say? If you read a section of scripture, if you read something, you retain about 10% of it. If you read it and listen to it, you're pushing 40 to 50%, okay? That's really important, okay? That'll help you. Okay, they give a final word on slide number 25. One crucial item to keep in mind as you read any Hebrew narrative is the presence of God in the narrative, okay? In any biblical narrative, God is the ultimate character, the supreme hero of the story. So when it says in Genesis 39, verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, it's a hint, okay? As things get bad for Joseph and things get really difficult, hint, hint, hint. Through it all, God's sovereign, and he's with Joseph. In the same way, when things perhaps get bad in your life, and this is something we're all dealing with right now in this global, pandemic, and again, as I'm recording this is late April 2020, and we're in a stay-at-home order and all this kind of stuff, and the economy's shaky, and so much stuff's going on because you've shut everything down. God is the ultimate character in our lives right now. So as tough as it gets, God's working behind the scenes. We've got to believe that. If that was true of Joseph and Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever, guess what? Same is true of us today, okay? To miss this dimension of the narrative is to miss the perspective of the narrative altogether, and precisely because of these explicit statements about God's presence in the narrative, one should constantly be aware of God's presence in more implicit ways, okay? The source of Joseph's dreams in chapter 37. The timing of the narrative that brought Joseph and his brothers and the Midianites together in Genesis chapter 37, verse 25. In other words, God's at work in all of this, okay? So I'm going to stop there.